Welcome, dear listener. I'm delighted that you could join me on this tranquil evening to delve into a captivating chapter of medieval history. As you settle in and release the day's stresses, I'd love to know your location and the time of day. It's always heartwarming to witness the global reach of our shared passion for rich history. If you enjoy calm historical storytelling like this, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. We have a treasure trove of captivating tales from the past waiting to lull you into a peaceful slumber, just as the one we're about to share. Tonight we'll embark on a journey back to a particularly tumultuous period in European history, the era of the Black Death. In the mid-4th century, a devastating plague swept across the continent, claiming millions of lives and forever reshaping the course of history. It was a time of immense suffering and loss, yet also of remarkable resilience, courage, and the indomitable human spirit. Before we delve into the harrowing details of the pestilence, let's set the scene and explore the daily lives of people in medieval Europe. Imagine a world vastly different from our own, a world devoid of modern medicine, instant communication, and the comforts we often take for granted. In the 1300s, the majority of Europeans were peasants, toiling tirelessly in the fields from sunrise to sunset, striving to make ends meet. They resided in simple one-room cottages with dirt floors and thatched roofs, their lives dictated by the rhythms of the seasons and the whims of their feudal lords. For most, life was a monotonous cycle of planting and harvesting, punctuated only by the occasional feast day or village fair. Their diet consisted of humble staples like bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could cultivate, with meat being a rare luxury reserved for special occasions. Clothing was simple and practical, crafted from coarse wool or linen, often passed down through generations. Amidst the hardships and challenges of medieval life, there were moments of joy and celebration. Weddings, christenings, and harvest festivals brought the community together with music, dancing, and feasting that could last for days. In a world without modern entertainment, people found pleasure in simple things, like well-loved stories, lively tunes on the fiddle, spirited games of dice or chess. Life looked quite different for those higher up the social ladder. Wealthy merchants and craftsmen lived in more comfortable dwellings with multiple rooms, glass windows, and even the occasional tapestry or painting. They enjoyed a more varied diet, with access to imported spices, wines, and delicacies from far-off lands. At the very top of society were the nobility, knights, lords, and ladies, who lived in grand castles and manor houses surrounded by servants and finery. They spent their days hunting, hawking, and engaging in courtly pursuits like music, poetry, and games of skill and chance. However, even the mightiest lord was not immune to the perils and uncertainties of medieval life. Disease, famine, and warfare were constant threats, and death was an ever-present spectre, claiming young and old alike. One such lord was Sir John of Gaddesden, a wealthy landowner in the English countryside. Born in 1280 to a noble family, John was the epitome of a medieval aristocrat, proud, chivalrous, and deeply pious. As a young man, he distinguished himself in battle, fighting alongside King Edward II in the wars against Scotland. But for all his bravery and skill at arms, John's true passion lay in the arts of healing. He was a learned man with a keen interest in the medical texts of ancient Greece and Rome. When he wasn't overseeing his vast estates or attending to matters of court, John could often be found in his private library, poring over dusty tomes and experimenting with new remedies and treatments. Little did he know that his medical knowledge would soon be put to the ultimate test. In the summer of 1348, a ship arrived at the port of Malcolm Regis, carrying an unseen passenger that would soon plunge all of Europe into an unimaginable nightmare. However, let's not rush ahead. Before we trace the devastating path of the Black Death across the continent, let's delve into the daily lives of the common folk of medieval Europe. Imagine a small village nestled amidst the rolling hills of France, Italy, or England. As the first light of dawn breaks, the rooster's crow pierces the morning stillness, awakening the villagers from their slumber. The men and older boys head out to the fields, armed with scythes and hoes, while the women and girls begin their daily chores. They milk the cows, churn butter, and bake bread in the communal ovens. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, the sound of hammering reverberates from the blacksmith's forge, mingling with the bleating of sheep and the lowing of cattle in the pastures. Children too young to work frolic in the streets, chasing hoops and wrestling in the dust, their laughter and shouts echoing off the walls of the village. In the village square, the local priest makes his rounds, offering blessings and collecting alms for the needy. He is a trusted figure, a source of both spiritual guidance and worldly advice for his flock. At the opposite end of the square, the alderman presides over court, settling disputes and dispensing justice according to the ancient laws and customs of the land. As the day progresses, the villagers gather in small groups to engage in gossip and exchange news. Rumors circulate about impending war with France, a bountiful harvest in the neighboring town, and a traveling minstrel who has captivated crowds with his enchanting songs and stories. For most, these snippets of information represent their sole connection to the wider world beyond their village gates. However, one piece of news sends a ripple of unease through the community, whispers of a strange and terrifying sickness that has struck down entire cities in distant lands. The pestilence, as some call it, or simply death, has descended upon their world. Some believe it is a divine punishment, while others attribute it to evil spirits or miasmas in the air. The truth remains unknown, but all pray for its swift passage. As the sun sets, the villagers return home, weary but content with a day's hard work. They gather around the hearth for a simple meal of stew and bread, expressing gratitude for their food and family. As they drift off to sleep on their straw mattresses, they dream of a tomorrow much like today, a life of toil and simplicity, yet also of community, faith, and the enduring rhythms of nature. Little do they know that their world is about to be shattered, and that the spectre of death is already approaching their humble village, carried on the winds of fate and the tides of history. Entire towns and villages have been decimated, leaving houses vacant and fields untended. The stench of death hangs heavy in the air. For those who remain, the psychological toll is immense. Many struggle to comprehend the unfathomable loss of loved ones, friends, and neighbors. In the absence of scientific understanding, fear and paranoia run rampant. Wild theories about the plague's origins circulate, with some blaming it on a misalignment of the planets or poisonous vapors rising from the Earth. Others view it as divine punishment for humanity's sins and moral failings. Tragically, this climate of fear breeds a frenzied search for scapegoats, and the Jewish community bears the brunt of this misdirected rage. Already marginalized in medieval society, Jews across Europe are accused of poisoning wells to spread the plague. These baseless conspiracies lead to horrific massacres, with thousands of innocents slaughtered from Strasbourg to Barcelona. In the grip of mass hysteria, reason itself seems to waver, and self-proclaimed prophets and madmen roam the land, proclaiming the end times. Flagellants, notorious penitents, marched from town to town, publicly whipping themselves as extreme atonement for society's sins. Stripped to the waist and chanting mournful hymns, they made a striking sight. Some revered them as holy men, while others recoiled at their gory spectacle. Pope Clement V condemned their extreme practices, yet anxious throngs still flocked to the flags, desperate for divine intervention against the plague. One representative flagellant was Conrad Schmidt, a pious monk from Thuringia. In the summer of 1349, Schmidt led a band of several hundred followers on a penitential circuit across central Germany. Eyewitness accounts describe the flagellants lashing themselves with knotted cords, studded with nails, leaving blood flowing down their backs. Schmidt claimed to possess a heavenly letter promising salvation to any town that welcomed his pilgrims. Overwhelmed by the plague's chaos, many local authorities grudgingly allowed the flagellants to pass, wary of hindering people's last hope. However, not all of Schmidt's followers were genuine penitents. Some used the roving band as camouflage to loot abandoned homes and prey on vulnerable peasants. Despite their holy appearance, the flagellants contributed to the unraveling of law and order amidst the plague's upheaval. In a dark irony, the flagellants likely helped spread the contagion itself by transporting infected fleas from town to town. Despite the best intentions of true believers like Conrad Schmidt, there was no way to eradicate the Black Death. Only time and the disease burning itself out would finally slow the relentless cycle of infection and demise. As the plague dragged on into 1350 and beyond, a profound weariness settled over Europe. After the initial shock, the sight of death ceased to inspire panic. Numbed survivors went through the grim motions of disposing of the dead with a matter-of-factness that belied the chaos around them. Many tried to escape into hedonism and debauchery, embracing the fleeting pleasures of the moment. However, even as society teetered on the brink of collapse, there were glimmers of human resilience and selflessness. Amidst the stories of wild excesses and moral breakdown, countless quieter tales emerged of everyday people rising to the occasion with incredible courage and compassion. Thousands of parish priests, monks, and nuns risked and lost their lives to comfort the sick and administer last rites. In Siena, a young widow named Pierre Thomé transformed her villa into an impromptu hospital, tending to dozens of plague victims. The early Renaissance poet Franco Sacchetti penned odes to the doomed martyrs of neighborly love. In rural areas, the vital rhythms of agriculture continued to stutter but ultimately persevered. The serfs and yeomen who worked the land could not abandon their hereditary plots, no matter how many fell ill. They planted and harvested as best they could, knowing that starvation would follow pestilence if the fields lay fallow. In the words of an anonymous English peasant diarist, "God may take my life, but he shall not take the wheat and rye so long as I have hands to work the soil." This simple philosophy of perseverance sustained the basic structures of medieval life even through the plague's darkest hours. As the years passed and the initial shock of the Black Death receded, Europeans gradually began to pick up the pieces. The plague itself never fully disappeared, but major outbreaks became more sporadic and localized. By the late 1350s, societies began to resume something approximating normalcy, albeit in a world turned upside down. The feudal system, already fraying before the plague began to unravel, was further weakened. With the countryside depopulated, agricultural labor suddenly became at a premium. Former serfs, once bound to the land, found they could command wages as free tenants and sharecroppers. The old obligations of feudal tenure held less and less sway. In the cities, surviving artisans and merchants ascended to new roles as wealthy elites. The old nobility, devastated by the plague, witnessed a decline in their powers. A burgeoning urban middle class emerged, laying the economic groundwork for the Renaissance. This social upheaval, however, faced resistance. Paranoid landowners lobbied for laws that restricted peasant movement and kept wages artificially low. In England, the Statute of Labourers attempted to bind workers to pre-existing conditions. Nevertheless, economic reality outpaced legal decrees. The common people had tasted newfound freedom and were reluctant to relinquish it. The story of the Giardinis of Tuscany exemplifies this transformative era. Before the plague, the Giardinis were impoverished sharecroppers struggling to make ends meet. However, when their landlords succumbed to the pestilence, the family boldly claimed their vacant plot as their own. By the 1360s, the industrious Giardinis had transformed into prosperous farmers. They even began leasing surplus land to other agriculturalists. While still far from nobility, the family had clawed their way into a new stratum of landowning yeomanry, a social rung that was scarcely imaginable just a generation earlier. By multiplying the Giardinis by thousands, one can begin to comprehend the seismic shifts triggered by the plague. Of course, this wave of social mobility had its limitations. True rags-to-riches stories remained rare, and core aristocratic privileges persisted. However, the old feudal certainties had cracked, paving the way for new opportunities. A child born into poverty in 1300 had vastly different expectations than his grandchild, born in 1360. Medically, the harsh lessons of the Black Death sparked a renewed interest in the healing arts. The spectacular failure of medieval remedies to curb the plague exposed the limitations of the classical Greek and Arabic medical canon. Learned physicians began to challenge established orthodoxies and experiment with innovative methods. The French surgeon Gaïda Scoliac, who treated plague victims in Avignon, published groundbreaking treatises emphasizing the significance of cleanliness and quarantine in controlling the spread of disease. The Italian doctor Tommaso del Garbo pioneered a more empirical approach to diagnosis and treatment, based on close observation of patients' symptoms rather than blind adherence to ancient authorities. While these innovations represented only incremental progress, it would be centuries before the development of modern germ theory and antibiotics. However, the plague years sowed seeds of doubt and curiosity that eventually blossomed into the scientific revolution. The Black Death also left its mark on medieval art and culture. For generations afterward, European art adopted a distinctly macabre style characterized by images of death and decay. Grinning skeletons danced across church murals and illuminated manuscripts, while tomb sculptures depicted gaunt, eaten corpses rather than peaceful sleepers. This morbid sensibility reached its zenith in the motif of the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, which portrayed the Grim Reaper leading people of all walks of life in a final fatal waltz. Kings and popes mingled with skeletons alongside prostitutes and peasants, a chilling reminder of death's indifferent disregard for rank and privilege. Simultaneously, a countervailing strain of humanism emerged in the aftermath of the plague. Surrounded by such death, many thinkers turned to celebrating the beauty and preciousness of life. The renowned Italian poet Petrarch composed sonnets exalting the joys of nature, love, and learning, a stark contrast to the era's preoccupations with mortality. This renewed appreciation for earthly existence contributed to the development of Renaissance humanism, which emphasized the dignity of the individual. No longer were people merely wretched sinners awaiting divine judgment. They were seen as inherently worthy creatures capable of shaping their own destinies. In this sense, the Black Death catalyzed the profound intellectual transformations that ultimately gave rise to the modern era. Like a stone thrown into a pond, the Black Death unleashed ripples that reverberated through the fabric of history, leaving an indelible mark on human experience for generations. The plague's echoes permeated folk tales, nursery rhymes, superstitions, and even everyday language. To this day, the Old English rhyme "Ring around the rosy" is believed to allude to the plague's characteristic rosy skin lesions, with the final verse, "We all fall down," evoking the grim toll of the pestilence. While the true origins of the rhyme remain a subject of debate, its association with the Black Death underscores the enduring legacy of this medieval tragedy on the collective imagination. For those who endured the plague, it was not merely a symbol or allegory, but a visceral and traumatic experience. The survivors emerged from the Black Death's long night into a world transformed, compelled to rebuild their lives in a new order. One such survivor was an Italian merchant named Giovanni Morelli. Before the plague, Mr. Morelli was a prosperous trader with a thriving family. However, in the span of a few brutal months in 1348, he lost his wife, all three of his children, his brother, and his sister-in-law to the plague. Emotionally devastated, Morelli withdrew from society, liquidating his business and dedicating much of his wealth to the church. For several years, he lived as a virtual hermit, grappling with his grief and anger at the divine. Gradually, Morelli began to claw his way back to a semblance of normalcy. He remarried, fathered new children, and restarted his merchant enterprises. While he never fully regained his former vitality, Morelli managed to forge a meaningful second act from the ruins of his past. In the late 1370s, nearing the end of his life, Morelli penned a memoir recounting his experiences. In it, he sought to find some sense of meaning or redemption amidst the senseless devastation wrought by the plague. "We are but humble vessels of a capricious God, Mr. I wrote. All we can do is fight to stay afloat in the storm and cherish the small mercies life offers." This hard-hitting philosophy of resilience and gratitude could serve as a fitting epitaph for the nameless multitudes who perished in the Black Death. In the face of one of history's most ruthless calamities, the survivors of the plague endured, never forgetting their traumas but also refusing to be consumed by them. Through countless acts of mourning and remembrance, humanity gradually began to heal. In the end, perhaps this is the Black Death's most enduring lesson. Not just a grim reminder of mortality, but a testament to the indomitable resilience of the human spirit. Even in the darkest of times, life persists, unfurling in all its fragile beauty. The medieval men and women who emerged from the plague's shadow, scarred but undaunted, stand as eloquent witnesses to this unyielding will to endure and rebuild. Their example continues to resonate through the corridors of history, a distant beacon guiding us through our own seasons of loss and renewal. In remembering the Black Death, we honor not only the dead, but the tenacious vitality of those who carried on, stubbornly gracing the scorched earth with ripe wheat and wild roses. May we do them the profound honor of safeguarding the world they bequeathed us, tending the precious ember of life against the encroaching darkness. Life amidst this medieval calamity was bleak and harrowing, an existence stalked by death and shrouded in dread. Yet somehow, in the very depths of this dark chapter, faint flickers of light emerged, glimmers of resilience, adaptation, and humanity's stubborn refusal to succumb. One such illuminating tale comes to us from Tours, a city nestled in modern-day Belgium that found itself in the plague's unforgiving path. As the plague ravaged the populace, decimating entire families, the townsfolk and local friars made a valiant effort to record the names and backgrounds of the deceased. This poignant gesture aimed to honor the dead and perhaps bring some semblance of dignity to their passing. These meticulously noted records, written in a sorrowful hand, paint a portrait of a community besieged but unbowed. Scanning the lists, one finds merchants, laborers, children, and a cross-section of medieval society united in their grim fate. However, amidst the tragedies, details that seem almost mundane to a modern eye emerge. A cobbler who succumbed after mending a pair of shoes, a fruit seller who perished clutching her wares, and a young couple cut down on the very eve of their wedding. These glimpses of everyday life, interrupted, reveal the plague's true intimate toll. Despite the devastation, the same roles that chronicle the dying hint at the slow reawakening of a city determined to weather the storm. By winter of 1349, the scribe notes a blacksmith reopening his forge, a widow bravely taking over her late husband's bakery, and an orphaned son apprenticing himself to a candle maker. Inch by stubborn inch, life persists. This theme of finding slivers of normalcy amidst the chaos recurs across plague-ravaged Europe, particularly in the French city of Rouen. Even as the sickness raged, local authorities attempted to bolster morale by staging a half-hearted mystery play in the town square. It was a feeble echo of the lively entertainments that had once brought the community together. However, for the shell-shocked audience huddled at a weary distance from one another, it was a desperately needed balm. Across the Channel in England, a manor lord named Henry of Gromont took pains to settle the debts and ensure the well-being of the soon-to-be deceased tenants under his care. It was a small act of conscientiousness, a stark contrast to the stories of callous nobles who retreated to their country estates, leaving their subjects to their grim fates. Even the era's artists, often preoccupied with the macabre, occasionally offered a more hopeful perspective. One anonymous painter from Siena, a city ravaged by the plague's onslaught, chose to depict Saint Sebastian, the classical patron of pestilence, not in the usual pose of grim martyrdom, but as a triumphant survivor. The arrow wounds of his torment had faded into faint scars on his unblemished skin. This daring statement of symbolic optimism served as a much-needed counterpoint to the danse macabre. Of course, these stories of fortitude and fellow feeling couldn't erase the Black Death's tremendous toll. It tore a gaping wound in the very fabric of 14th-century society, a wound so raw and deep that it would never truly heal. Art, religion, politics, economics all emerged from the crucible of the plague as something permanently altered, tinged by an existential trauma that would linger for generations. Yet, as we reflect on this dark chapter from our vantage point centuries later, it's crucial to remember that even in the depths of the crisis, medieval people found small ways to hold fast to their humanity. They mourned their dead, endured their labors, sought meaning in their faith, and fought with whatever feeble weapons they possessed to preserve those fragile threads of community and conscience that make us who we are, even as death itself clawed at the door. In the end, perhaps this is the Black Death's most enduring lesson. Not merely a grim reminder of our mortality or a cautionary tale of society's fragility, but a testament to the stubborn spark of human resilience that refuses to be extinguished even in our darkest hour. It's a poignant message, perhaps more relevant now than ever. As our modern world grapples with its own zeitgeist of uncertainty, it's natural to wonder how future generations will perceive our own trials and tribulations. Will they see a reflection of the medieval world's quiet resilience in our response to adversity? Will they recognize the small acts of kindness and courage that often go unnoticed in the heat of the moment? Only time, that impartial judge, will provide the answer. For now, we could learn valuable lessons from our distant forebears. By honoring our losses, holding fast to hope, and celebrating the way stubborn seedlings of normalcy seem to emerge from the cracks of calamity, we can find solace in the knowledge that even in our bleakest moments, the faint embers of humanity endure. These embers are ready to rekindle and bring back vivid life in the distant, unwritten tomorrow. As we close the book on this dark and dimly glimpsed chapter of history, let's carry forward its profound wisdom. Even in the face of the unthinkable, we possess an extraordinary strength, a beacon of light in the darkness, and a guiding star that will lead us through this long, uncertain night into the promise of a new dawn. The road may be arduous, and the scars may linger, but the human spirit, tested yet unbroken, marches ever on. Part 3. Plague ravages Europe. The pestilence tightened its grip on Europe, leaving no corner of society untouched. From the humblest peasant to the mightiest king, all trembled before the spectre of the Black Death. In France, Princess Joan, the beloved daughter of King Edward III of England, succumbed to the plague on her way to her wedding in Castile. At just 14 years old, the tragic princess was buried in Bordeaux, her dreams of queenship cut short by the cruel hand of fate. Across the Channel in England, the plague struck at the very heart of power. In 1349, the pestilence claimed the life of Lady Helena de Bohun, the cherished daughter of the powerful Earl of Hereford. Her grieving father, a prominent noble in the realm, was left to mourn as the plague ravaged his household and estates. The Earl's loss was just one among countless tales of sorrow that unfolded in manor houses and castles across Europe. As the plague raged on, it left an indelible mark on the arts and culture of the time. In the masterful fresco of the Campo Santo cemetery in Pisa, the triumph of death looms large, a macabre testament to the pervasive presence of mortality in the medieval mind. The unknown artist's vivid depiction of corpses and demons captured the morbid fascination and terror that gripped Europe in the face of the Black Death. In music as well, the plague spectre resonated. The haunting strains of the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, echoed through the courts and cloisters of Europe, a chilling reminder of the great leveler that spared no man, regardless of their status. This allegorical theme, featuring skeletons leading figures from all walks of life in a ghoulish dance, became a fixture of late medieval art and culture, a grim reflection of a world haunted by death. As the plague tightened its grip, the medieval world descended into a nightmare landscape of deserted villages, abandoned fields, and mass graves. In Avignon, the home of the papal court, the death toll mounted so high that Pope Clement V, the Sixth, was compelled to consecrate the entire Rhine River so that the corpses could be disposed of for burial. The once bustling streets of the city transformed into ghostly and quiet avenues, echoing with the eerie tolling of the plague bells that marked the passage of the dead. Yet even amidst the horrors of the plague, there were glimmers of human resilience and courage. In the English village of Am, the courageous villagers made the ultimate sacrifice to contain the pestilence. When the plague struck in 1665, the villagers, led by their brave rector William Messon, took the extraordinary step of quarantining themselves, sealing off the village to prevent the spread of the disease to neighboring towns. For 14 months, the villagers of Iam endured unimaginable suffering, losing over half their population to the plague. Despite this, their noble sacrifice saved countless lives in the surrounding region, a testament to the power of human solidarity in the face of unimaginable adversity. However, such tales of heroism were rare in a world descending into despair and chaos. As the plague raged on and the death toll mounted, medieval society began to fracture. In the next chapter, we'll delve into how the Black Death pushed Europe to the brink of collapse, unleashing a wave of social unrest, religious fervor, and persecution that would leave an indelible mark on the medieval world. Word count 581. Part 4. Society breaks down. As the Black Death tightened its grip on medieval Europe, the very fabric of society began to unravel. The plague, indiscriminately killing both rich and poor, threw the old social order that had governed life for centuries into chaos. Faced with such existential terror, the veneer of civilization wore thin, and the darker impulses of human nature emerged. In the hardest-hit regions, law and order completely collapsed. Roving bands of marauders terrorized the countryside, taking advantage of the breakdown of authority to loot and pillage with impunity. In the cities, crime and violence surged as desperate survivors struggled to secure dwindling food and resources. The once bustling markets and fairs, the lifeblood of medieval commerce, ground to a halt as people hunkered down in their homes, too afraid to venture out. Even the bonds of family and community, the foundation of medieval life, began to fray under the strain of the plague. In the Italian city of Siena, the chronicler Agnolo Dura documented the grim toll the pestilence took on the ties that bind. Father, abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother, another, he wrote. For this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight, and so they died. Amidst the raging plague and mounting death toll, a profound sense of desperation gripped Europe. Desperate to comprehend the calamity that had befallen them, many Europeans turned to scapegoats, and the Jews, long a target of suspicion and prejudice in medieval society, found themselves at the center of this frenzy. Rumors spread like wildfire, accusing the Jews of poisoning the wells and causing the plague. Soon, the flames of anti-Semitic violence ignited across the continent, culminating in the tragic events in Strasbourg. A Jewish community that had resided in the city for centuries was rounded up and burned alive, their anguished cries reverberating through the streets. Similar atrocities unfolded in towns and cities across the continent, as fear and hatred found an outlet in senseless brutality. In stark contrast, others sought solace in extreme acts of religious devotion. One of the most vivid and tragic examples was the flagellants, bands of religious zealots who roamed the countryside, whipping themselves in penance for humanity's sins. Clad in white robes and hoods, these flagellants would march into towns and villages, chanting hymns and prayers as they lashed their own flesh until the blood flowed. Initially hailed as holy men, their extreme acts of piety were seen as a means to appease an angry God and bring an end to the plague. However, as their numbers swelled and their behavior became increasingly erratic, the Church grew wary. Pope Clement V denounced the flagellants as heretics, leading to their persecution and expulsion from towns. Their brief moment of glory was extinguished by the very forces they had sought to confront. As European society teetered on the brink of collapse, even the most learned men of the time grappled with the incomprehensible nature of the calamity that had befallen them. The finest medical minds in Europe, steeped in the ancient teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, found themselves utterly helpless in the face of the plague's relentless onslaught. Their traditional remedies, including bloodletting and boil lancing, proved ineffective against the relentless onslaught of the plague. Even the doctors fell victim to the very disease they were attempting to cure. In this atmosphere of despair and confusion, wild theories and superstitions flourished. Some attributed the plague to the alignment of the planets, while others pointed to humanity's sins or the wrath of God. In England, whispers circulated that the plague was caused by a foul miasma seeping from the earth. Meanwhile, in France, people hung herbs and flowers in their homes to ward off the pestilential vapors. Amidst the fear and chaos, glimmers of hope and resilience emerged. Even as the plague ravaged their communities, people found ways to adapt and persevere. In the German city of Nuremberg, the renowned artist Albrecht Dürer continued to create his masterpieces. His haunting self-portraits and apocalyptic visions served as a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. In the English village of Am, the story of the villagers' selfless sacrifice gained renewed significance. As word of their bravery spread, it became a symbol of the best of human nature, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the light of compassion and solidarity could still shine through. However, the road ahead would be long and arduous. As the plague gradually receded, Europe was left grappling with the profound social and economic upheavals wrought by the Black Death. In our next chapter, we will delve into how the people of the Middle Ages began to pick up the pieces and forge a new path forward in a world forever altered by the greatest catastrophe in human history. Word count 853. Part 5, Glimmers of Hope. As the plague finally began to loosen its grip on Europe in the early 1350s, the continent was left reeling in its wake. The Black Death had taken a staggering toll, with estimates suggesting that between a third and half of the population had perished. Cities and towns lay abandoned, their streets haunted by the spirits of the departed. The countryside was dotted with deserted villages and fields, as if the land itself mourned the lost generations. Yet even in the depths of despair, glimmers of hope and resilience emerged. Across Europe, communities embarked on the slow and arduous journey of rebuilding, gradually piecing together the shattered remnants of their lives. In the Italian city of Florence, the renowned poet and scholar Giovanni Boccaccio chronicled the city's hesitant recovery in his magnum opus, the Dameron. The book's vivid tales of love, lust, and human folly served as a testament to the enduring vitality of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable loss. As the immediate threat of the plague receded, people cautiously ventured out of their homes and re-entered the world. Merchants and tradesmen resumed their businesses, albeit on a smaller scale. The once thriving fairs and markets that had been the lifeblood of the medieval economy slowly sputtered back to life as people cautiously resumed trading and bartering. In the countryside, survivors took stock of their diminished numbers and embarked on the back-breaking task of rebuilding. With so many hands lost to the plague, labor became scarce, and those who remained could command higher wages and better working conditions. For the first time in centuries, the balance of power between lords and peasants began to shift as the great landowners were compelled to negotiate with their workers to maintain the viability of their estates. This newfound bargaining power would have profound implications for the social and economic order of medieval Europe. In England, the aftermath of the plague witnessed the rise of a new class of yeoman farmers, smallholders who were able to acquire land and achieve a measure of economic independence. In France, the plague disrupted the feudal system, sowing the seeds for the great peasant revolts of the 14th and 15th centuries. The downtrodden masses began asserting their rights and demanding a better life. However, the plague's impact extended beyond the economic and social spheres, leaving an indelible mark on medieval Europe's art, culture, and intellectual life. Following the Black Death, a new morbid fascination emerged in European art and literature. Painters and writers grappled with the spectre of mortality that had haunted their world. In England, the great poet Geoffrey Chaucer penned his Canterbury Tales in the plague's aftermath. This sprawling work captured the full spectrum of medieval society in all its complexity and contradiction. In The Pardoner's Tale, Chaucer explored the theme of greed and its consequences. In The Knight's Tale, he delved into the enduring power of love in the face of death and destruction. On the stage, the plague's legacy manifested in the emergence of a new dramatic form, the morality play. These allegorical works featured characters representing abstract qualities like vice and virtue, intended to impart moral lessons and guide the audience toward a righteous life. The most renowned of these plays, Every Man, grappled with the inevitability of death and the significance of living a good and honest life in preparation for the afterlife. However, perhaps the most enduring cultural legacy of the Black Death was its transformative effect on people's relationship with religion. Faced with such overwhelming tragedy, many sought solace in a more personal and direct connection with God. The plague years witnessed a surge in mysticism and devotional practices as individuals endeavored to forge a closer bond with the divine. One striking example of this trend was the rise of the Brethren of the Common Life, a lay religious movement that emphasized humility, simplicity, and a direct relationship with God. Founded by the Dutch scholar Geer Groe in the late 14th century, the Brethren rejected the pomp and hierarchy of the established church, instead embracing a life of quiet contemplation and service to others. Their teachings profoundly influenced the great humanist scholars of the Renaissance, including Erasmus and Thomas Ampus. Their work, which emphasized the imitation of Christ, became one of the most widely read devotional texts of the era. The Brethren's focus on personal piety and the value of education laid the groundwork for the intellectual and spiritual ferment of the centuries to come. However, even as Europe emerged from the shadow of the Black Death, the spectre of the plague lingered. The disease would recur repeatedly, each time leaving a fresh trail of devastation in its wake. In our final chapter, we will explore the enduring legacy of the Black Death and its profound impact on the course of human history. As the immediate crisis of the Black Death subsided in the late 14th century, the people of Europe were left to confront the profound changes the pandemic had wrought. The plague had claimed countless lives, decimated entire communities, and shaken the very foundations of medieval society. Amidst the destruction and despair, a new Europe was beginning to emerge. One of the most significant effects of the Black Death was its transformation of the social and economic landscape of the continent. With a sudden shortage of labor due to the high mortality rate, workers found themselves in a stronger bargaining position. Across Europe, wages began to rise and working conditions improved as the great landowners and merchants competed for the services of a dwindling pool of laborers. This shift in the balance of power would have far-reaching consequences for the future of Europe. In England, the years of the plague witnessed the emergence of a new class of yeoman farmers and craftsmen who capitalized on the newfound economic opportunities to attain a degree of prosperity and independence. Conversely, in Italy, the Black Death played a pivotal role in fueling the growth of the renowned merchant republics of Venice and Genoa. The disruption caused by the plague in the established trade routes paved the way for novel avenues of commerce and enterprise. However, the impact of the plague extended beyond the economic realm, profoundly influencing the intellectual and cultural landscape of Europe. As scholars and artists grappled with the existential questions posed by the pandemic within the universities and monasteries of Europe, a new spirit of inquiry began to take root. Thinkers embarked on a quest to comprehend the natural world and the place of humanity within it. Among the most significant figures in this intellectual awakening was the English Franciscan friar Roger Bacon. A brilliant polymath with an insatiable curiosity, Bacon staunchly advocated for the utilization of observation and experimentation in the pursuit of knowledge. In his most renowned work, the Opus Magis, he argued that genuine understanding could only be achieved through meticulous study of nature rather than the blind reliance on ancient authorities. Bacon's ideas would have a profound influence on the development of modern science, paving the way for the remarkable discoveries of the Renaissance and beyond. However, he was not the sole thinker who was shaped by the experience of the Black Death. Across Europe, scholars and writers were engaged in profound discussions about the profound questions posed by the pandemic. These discussions encompassed the nature of God, the meaning of suffering, and the appropriate role of government during times of crisis. In Italy, the renowned poet and humanist Petrarch composed his celebrated Triumphs, a series of allegorical poems that delved into the themes of love, death, and fame. In his Triumph of Death, Petrarch grappled with the ephemeral nature of earthly glory and the inescapable reality of mortality, themes that would endure for centuries. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Black Death was its profound impact on public health and disease prevention. In the aftermath of the plague, cities across Europe embarked on initiatives to enhance sanitation and hygiene, from constructing new water systems to establishing quarantine measures for ships and travelers in Venice. Authorities took significant steps. Notably, Venice established the world's first permanent quarantine station on Lazaretto Novo, requiring incoming ships to anchor for 40 days before entering the city. The Venetians also pioneered the use of health passes for travelers, a practice that would become widespread in subsequent centuries. Despite Europe's gradual recovery from the Black Death's devastation, the specter of the plague lingered. The disease recurred repeatedly, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. In the 17th century, Milan, Italy, suffered a third of its population loss due to the plague. Meanwhile, London endured the devastating Great Plague of 1665 to 1666, claiming over 100,000 lives. Yet, even in the face of such unimaginable tragedy, the human spirit demonstrated remarkable resilience. After each new outbreak, people rose to rebuild their lives. As the plague tightened its grip on Europe, social order began to unravel and crumble. With the immense loss of life, there was no one left to enforce the law or maintain the fabric of everyday life. Fields lay fallow as farmers succumbed to the pestilence, and shops stood empty, their owners interred in mass graves. In many towns and villages, the living struggled to bury the deceased. Amidst this chaos, some individuals succumbed to their darkest impulses. Looting and lawlessness became rampant as desperate survivors scavenged for food and valuables in abandoned homes. Paranoia and suspicion spread like wildfire, with neighbors turning against one another in the desperate struggle for survival. Some blamed the plague on outsiders and minorities. Across Europe, Jewish communities faced brutal pogroms and persecutions, falsely accused of deliberately poisoning wells to spread the pestilence. In 1349, the Jewish inhabitants of Strasbourg were rounded up and burned alive on a wooden platform in the city's cemetery. Similar atrocities occurred in Cologne, Mainz, and other German cities as terrified Christians sought convenient scapegoats. Even the church, usually a bastion of stability in medieval society, was thrown into turmoil by the plague. The sheer number of priests and monks who perished left a shortage of clergy to provide last rites to the dying. Some men of God abandoned their flocks altogether, fleeing to the countryside in a desperate attempt to escape infection. Others resorted to extreme measures in hopes of appeasing what they perceived as God's wrath manifested in the plague. One of the most extraordinary examples was the flagellants, bands of penitents who roamed from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in acts of masochistic devotion. Originating in Central Europe, the flagellants movement quickly spread during the plague. In the late 1340s, groups of men, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, marched barefoot between cities, chanting hymns and prayers. Clad in white robes marked with red crosses, they carried scourges of knotted leather straps tipped with iron spikes. Upon reaching a town, the flagellants would gather in the main square, forming a circle around a leader who delivered impassioned sermons on sin and redemption. At a signal, the men would strip to the waist and flock their own backs to the bone, splattering the cobblestones with blood. This gruesome ritual was performed 3 times a day for 33 days, symbolizing Christ's 33 years on earth. Shocking as these displays were, the flagellants initially enjoyed widespread support from a populace desperate for relief from the plague. Many townsfolk welcomed them as holy men, offering food, shelter, and even joining their processions. The penitents claimed that their blood mingled with Christ's, granting them the power to perform miracles and absolve sins without priestly intervention. However, church leaders soon grew alarmed by the flagellants' growing ranks and radical ideas. The Pope condemned them as heretics and urged the faithful to place their trust in prayer and the sacraments, rather than exhibitionist displays of penance. By the early 1350s, the movement was on the wane as many flagellants succumbed to the very plague they aimed to avert. Authorities cracked down hard on those who persisted in the practice. In 1349, the King of England ordered the arrest of all flagellants in his realm. The consistory court of Liege condemned the movement's ringleaders to perpetual imprisonment. Flagellant groups still surfaced sporadically in later years, but never again on the same scale as during the Black Death. The story of the flagellants is a fascinating yet gruesome example of how some Europeans responded to the plague with desperate acts of fanaticism. It serves as a testament to the Black Death's power to upend even the most deeply held beliefs and practices of medieval society. Next, let's explore how even in the darkest days of the plague, there were still glimmers of hope and resilience. The everyday heroes who risked their lives to care for the sick and keep their communities functioning as best they could. Even in the face of unimaginable horror, the human spirit endured as the plague dragged on year after year. The death toll mounted to staggering heights. It's estimated that between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death wiped out anywhere from 1/3 to half of Europe's population, amounting to as many as 50 million people. Some regions suffered worse than others. In Italy, the fatalities may have reached 50 to 60%. In parts of France and England, up to 70% of the population perished. The medieval world was accustomed to death on a certain scale, with high infant mortality, perennial famine, and occasional bad flu seasons. However, the plague slaughter defied belief and left behind a devastated landscape of empty villages, crumbling infrastructure, and decimated families. In many places, there was scarcely anyone left to work the fields, tend to the sick, or bury the dead. Despite the depths of the catastrophe, there were still those who rose to the occasion with extraordinary courage and selflessness. Consider the example of Agnolo Dura, a chronicler from the Italian city of Siena. In 1348, the plague struck Siena with devastating force, killing over half the population in just a few months. Amidst the chaos and carnage, Dürer took it upon himself to organize proper Christian burials for the victims, many of whom were dumped unceremoniously in mass graves. He meticulously recorded the names of the deceased and ensured that they were interred with prayers and rites. This was a Herculean task and a terribly dangerous one, as handling plague-ridden corpses was almost a certain death sentence. However, Dürer carried on as long as he could, laying his fellow citizens to rest with a scrap of dignity. Similar acts of quiet heroism played out across Europe as priests, nuns, and monastics worked on the front lines of the plague response. In Lübeck, a city in northern Germany, the local archbishop led a procession through the streets to bless the sick and console the grieving. In Austria, monks at the Abbey of Zwettl opened their doors and transformed the monastery into a makeshift hospital, nursing plague victims without regard for their own safety. Many of these men and women sacrificed their lives in the effort to bring succor to the suffering. There were moments of extraordinary resilience from the infected as well. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio left a first-hand account of Florence in the grips of the plague. He vividly describes the disintegration of social structures, the widespread terror, and the delirious ramblings of those afflicted by the pestilential fever. However, he also highlights the remarkable resilience of some of the afflicted, who fought valiantly to the very end, clinging to life against all odds. Boccaccio recounts how some exhausted individuals dragged their bodies into churches, while others sought refuge in their own homes. Remarkably, there were even those who, nurtured by the love of their kin and without medical advice, overcame the foulness of the fatal disease by sheer determination to survive. In London, the suffering of the poor took center stage. The plague struck the city's crowded slums with particular cruelty, leaving countless households devastated and children orphaned and destitute. In response, the city's leaders enacted the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, imposing restrictions on wages and prices to prevent a complete economic collapse. The wealthy also contributed to the relief efforts through acts of charity. Sir Walter Manny, a knight serving King Edward III, generously donated a plot of land in London's Smithfield district for use as an emergency burial ground. This site, later known as East Smithfield, ultimately accommodated over 2,400 plague victims. Archaeological excavations at East Smithfield have provided poignant glimpses into these anonymous individuals. Among the findings were a young woman buried cradling a 5-month-old infant to her chest and a little girl adorned with a necklace of inexpensive beads. Even amidst the bleakest circumstances, there were still instances of determined normalcy. In the university town of Cambridge, students and masters continued their studies defiantly. Despite the devastation surrounding them, colleges implemented strict quarantine measures, isolating themselves from the outside world as much as possible. Remarkably, they managed to keep the lamps of learning burning while so much else succumbed to darkness. These stories of selflessness, resilience, and unwavering hope are as much a part of the plague years as the horrors that often dominate our focus. The Black Death serves as a poignant reminder that even in the most extreme circumstances, human beings possess the remarkable capacity for profound decency and courage. While it unleashed the darkest aspects of human nature, it also revealed the best in others. As the plague gradually waned in the early 1350s, survivors embarked on the arduous task of rebuilding their shattered world. Although the journey was long and fraught with challenges, the ordeal sowed the seeds of transformation that would ultimately reshape European society in unexpected ways. In our subsequent section, we will delve into the far-reaching consequences of the Black Death, exploring how it disrupted the foundations of the feudal system, opened up new opportunities for women and the lower classes, and laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and Reformation that would follow. The Black Death was an unimaginable tragedy, yet it also marked a pivotal turning point in history. As the plague's second wave swept across Europe, entire towns and regions were virtually obliterated. Italian writer Boccaccio lamented the overwhelming number of corpses brought to churches daily and hourly, leaving no consecrated ground for burial. In Avenue, France, the residents of the papal court, over half the city's population, perished within a few months. One chronicler described bodies piling up in mass graves like layers of fish. Many towns simply ceased to exist. The English village of Pendlebury, for instance, dwindled from 66 households in 1346 to just 8 survivors by 1351. Some villages suffered a staggering loss of 70 to 80% of their inhabitants. Amidst this devastation, social order began to unravel. With so many lives lost, normal life ground to a halt. Crops withered in fields without the care of their owners, valuable possessions lay abandoned in empty houses, and the stench of death permeated the air. Boasio vividly described the plight of Florence, highlighting the extreme suffering endured by the lower and most of the middle classes. Most of them remained in their homes either due to poverty or in hopes of safety, and fell ill by the thousands. Many ended their lives on the streets, either at night or during the day. Of those who died at home, their neighbors, more concerned with the smell of their decaying bodies than with charity, discovered their passing only by the putrid odor. Anarchy and lawlessness prevailed. Bands of thieves roamed the countryside, looting abandoned homes. Merchants gouged prices on dwindling food and supplies. Neighbor turned against neighbor in growing paranoia. Anyone who coughed or appeared pale might be driven away or even stoned to death. Jews in particular suffered persecution, accused of poisoning wells or practicing witchcraft to spread the plague. Thousands of Jews were burned alive or brutally massacred. In Strasbourg, over 900 Jews were publicly burned in a single day in February 1349. By the time the violence subsided, over 200 Jewish communities had been eradicated. Even the church, which offered the only glimmer of hope to the pious, was in turmoil. Nearly 40% of the clergy had perished. The Pope consecrated the river to allow bodies to be dumped en masse. Survivors questioned how a merciful God could inflict such suffering. One group who attempted to take matters into their own hands were the flagellants. Clad in white robes, their faces and chests bare, they marched from town to town, whipping themselves bloody to atone for the sins they believed had brought the plague. Led by a defrocked priest, Conrad Schmidt, one group of 200 flagellants marched 700 meters from Holland to Aachen, their numbers swelling to over 400. Twice a day, the flagellants would perform their macabre ritual, reading aloud a heavenly letter that had supposedly fallen from the sky in Jerusalem. Then they would flog themselves with leather straps studded with iron spikes, all the while singing penitent hymns. The spikes tore their flesh to a pulp. After the performance, the flagellants would shed their blood-soaked garments and prostrate themselves on the ground in the shape of a cross, imploring for divine mercy. Initially, the flagellants were welcomed in towns and villages, as the desperate populace eagerly participated in the scourging and joined their processions. However, when this self-inflicted suffering failed to halt the plague's relentless advance, public sentiment turned against them. The Pope condemned their heretical practices, accusing them of spreading disease and defying church authority. Faced with the prospect of excommunication and arrest, the flagellant movement gradually declined. As the weeks dragged on into months, the plague's devastating impact permeated every facet of society. Workers perished in droves, and survivors demanded higher wages, leading desperate landlords to coerce tenants into remaining as tenants. In England, King Edward III issued an ordinance freezing wages at pre-plague levels. Guilds implemented new regulations to restrict competition from outsiders for dwindling jobs. The plague disrupted the very fabric of medieval life. Church bells, which typically rang in a soothing daily cycle of calls to prayer, now incessantly signaled the dead and dying. Mass graves could not be dug quickly enough, and bodies were piled in heaps or dumped into rivers. The parish priest, John Clenn of Ireland, confessed in his journal that he wrote, "waiting among the dead for death to come." Amidst this widespread devastation, however, there were instances of selflessness and hope. While many clergy abandoned their flocks, others remained to minister to the sick and perform last rites, sacrificing their lives in the process. Doctors like Guy de Oliac, who later chronicled the plague in a renowned account, continued to tend to patients despite the inherent risks. Some towns managed to endure the storm through sheer determination and unwavering solidarity. In the Derbyshire village of Eyam, the villagers voluntarily quarantined themselves to prevent the plague from spreading to neighbouring towns. This was done after their own tailor inadvertently brought the pestilence north from London in a parcel of cloth. Under the leadership of their rector, William Messon, the villagers left money in vinegar-filled holes in boundary rocks in exchange for food and supplies from neighboring villages. Despite losing over half their population, their sacrifice likely saved many more lives. As the Black Death finally began to subside in the early 1350s, Europe was left utterly transformed. Between a third and half of the population had been wiped out, resulting in an estimated 75 to 200 million deaths. Survivors emerged from the trauma and disorientation of burying their loved ones and rebuilding their shattered lives and livelihoods. The plague's passage left an indelible mark on the collective psyche. The dance macabre or dance of death became a common motif in art and literature, depicting the skeletal figure of death leading people from all walks of life in a morbid procession to the grave. It served as a stark reminder that no one, regardless of their social status, could escape death's grasp. However, as the shadow of the Black Death slowly lifted, there were surprising signs of rejuvenation and resilience. Abandoned land was recultivated, towns and cities began to bustle again with returning survivors and new migrants, and the population, though diminished, created a demand for serfs and peasants. This demand led to agitation for higher wages and better conditions, gradually loosening the rigid feudal system. Medicine and public health also saw advances. The miasma theory, which held that disease spread through poisonous vapors, gained new adherents and spurred sanitation efforts. Moreover, survivors of the plague mysteriously seemed to have immunity, a key observation that contributed to later inoculation practices. The influx of rural migrants revitalized cities and sparked cultural innovations that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. Through a vivid collection of vignettes, we've traced the grim passage of the Black Death through the 14th century. We've witnessed how this devastating epidemic ravaged medieval society, yet also sowed the seeds of social transformation and resilience, a pattern that has resonated throughout history. Crisis and suffering laid bare both the darkest and most noble aspects of human nature. The voices and stories we've heard stand as a testament to the fortitude and spirit of those who endured one of history's most challenging times. Young Guillaume Lemieux, his thumbs and index fingers gangrenous from the plague, bravely embarked on the arduous journey of learning to write again. Marie Feli, with unwavering compassion, tirelessly cared for the dying in a Parisian hospital. Brother Maurice, the Benedictine monk of Westminster Abbey, faithfully chronicled the plague's toll, even as his fellow monks succumbed one by one. These medieval lives, while seemingly distant and foreign, resonate with a striking familiarity in our own times. Separated by centuries, we find ourselves walking in their footsteps each time we confront the primal fears and communal challenges of our own pandemics and disasters. In their tragedies, we find our own pain, while in their perseverance we discover hope. The shadow of the Black Death lingered for generations, its mysteries unsolved until modern science could decipher the DNA of the bacterium Yersinia pestis. However, the human spirit remains an enigma, beyond the reach of simple decoding. The men and women of the Middle Ages faced the brink of societal collapse, head-on. In their suffering and resilience, they left us a complex portrait of a world upended, yet determined to endure. From the bustling cities to the secluded hamlets, the Black Death tightened its grip on medieval Europe, leaving no corner untouched. The pestilence infiltrated communities with astonishing speed and merciless efficiency, decimating populations with a chilling finality. In many of the most severely affected regions, over half the population would succumb to the disease within a matter of months. Entire villages and towns were obliterated, their names forever erased from history. The sheer scale of death was unprecedented in Europe. It is estimated that the Black Death claimed between 75 and 200 million lives in just a few years. Eyewitness accounts vividly depict the relentless onslaught of the plague. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio describes the scene in Florence. The sheer number of corpses brought to the churches daily and hourly exceeded the available consecrated ground for burial. When all the graves were filled, massive trenches were dug in the churchyards, into which new arrivals were laid in layers, akin to stacking merchandise on a ship. Similar scenes unfolded in towns and cities across Europe. The dead piled up at an alarming rate, far exceeding the capacity for burial. Many were unceremoniously dumped into mass graves, denied the customary respectful rites of passage. The pervasive stench of death hung heavily over medieval streets and squares, creating an atmosphere that seemed to many to herald the arrival of the apocalypse. Amidst this devastation and dread, a few tales of heroic self-sacrifice stand out. One such example is the small village of Ayham in central England. When the plague arrived in Ayham in 1665, centuries after the initial Black Death, but during a later outbreak, the villagers made an extraordinary decision. Rather than flee and risk spreading the disease to neighboring towns, they voluntarily quarantined themselves. Under the leadership of their courageous rector, William Messon, the people of Ayham stoically accepted their fate. They ceased all travel and trade with the outside world. Knowing they were likely doomed, the villagers focused on containing the plague to protect others. For 14 months, Ayham battled the pestilence alone. When the ordeal finally ended, over 75% of the village had perished, but not a single surrounding community fell victim to the plague. The heroic sacrifice of the villages of Ayham saved countless lives. However, such nobility was rare during the Black Death. Panic, paranoia, and lawlessness prevailed as the usual social order crumbled. Dark human impulses filled the void, leading to rampant theft and banditry. Towns barricaded themselves against desperate refugees. The plague shook people's faith to the core, causing many to resort to wild superstition and misdirected blame. Europe's Jewish communities became a tragic scapegoat, with unfounded rumors spreading that they had poisoned whales and caused the plague. Vicious pogroms resulted in the massacre of thousands of innocent Jews across Europe. In Strasbourg, the entire Jewish population was herded into a wooden building and burned alive, marking one of the darkest chapters of the Black Death. On the other hand, some believed the plague was God's just punishment for humanity's sins. The notorious band of penitents, known as the Flagellants, roamed Europe during the plague years, publicly flogging themselves as a form of atonement. They believed that vigorous whipping with scourges and lashes, studded with sharp spikes, could redirect God's wrath and atone for worldly wickedness. Naked to the waist and chanting mournful hymns, flagellants became a common sight on Europe's roads, their numbers swelling into the hundreds and thousands under the leadership of fanatical doomsayers. However, their theological arguments were shaky at best. Pope Clement V denounced them as heretics and a danger to public order. Ironically, the flagellants' mass gatherings may have inadvertently helped spread the plague, as their open wounds provided an invitation to infection. Amidst the chaos and trauma of the Black Death, medical science was woefully ill-equipped to combat the pestilence. The true cause of the plague, a bacterial infection spread by fleas, lay centuries in the future. Medieval doctors relying on ancient Greek theories of bodily humors were perplexed by the virulence and rapid spread of diseases. Common treatments included bloodletting, boil lancing, and the application of frogs and leeches. Some physicians donned long, ominous beak-like masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, believed to ward off evil air. Their ghostly foreboding costumes became an enduring symbol of the plague years. As one might expect, medieval medicine proved largely ineffective against the Black Death. In fact, many treatments weakened the body's natural defenses and reduced a patient's chances of survival. With no cure in sight, a sense of hopelessness and resignation settled over Europe. Art and culture turned increasingly morbid, reflecting the era's inescapable atmosphere of death. The danse macabre, or dance of death, emerged as a common motif in medieval paintings, frescoes, and woodcuts. These grim works depicted skeletal figures of death leading people from all walks of life in a final haunting dance. Porpora and King, a young maiden and a wizarded crone, all danced together under death's grinning dominion. The message was clear: the plague made everyone equal, and none could escape the Reaper's inexorable summons. Other artistic responses were more poignant than morbid. Giovanni Boccaccio's masterpiece, the Decameron, is set amidst the ravages of the plague in Florence. It tells the story of 10 young nobles who flee to the countryside, where they spend their time sharing stories. Among the 100 tales are stories of love, lust, wit, and folly. On one level, it's a work of escapism, an attempt to find humor and humanity amidst the horror. However, the plague is always present as a backdrop, a constant reminder of life's fragility and preciousness. Poetry of the time also grappled with the enormity of the Black Death. The English author Geoffrey Chaucer composed his famous work, The Canterbury Tales, in the aftermath of the plague. While the pestilence is not the poem's main focus, its shadow looms over the text. Chaucer's diverse cast of pilgrims, including the knight, the monk, the miller, and the wife of Bath, are all survivors embarking on one last earthly journey together. Their stories are imbued with a vivid immediacy and a seize-the-day spirit, forged by the fires of the plague. As the 1350s progressed, the Black Death gradually lost its momentum. Some scholars speculate that the bacterium evolved to become less virulent over time, while others suggest that there were simply fewer vulnerable hosts to infect after the initial waves of fever. Regardless of the reason, outbreaks became more sporadic and contained. Slowly, Europeans emerged from their long collective nightmare. The aftershocks, of course, would continue for generations. The Black Death left medieval society deeply traumatized. Historians estimate that Europe's population wouldn't return to its pre-plague levels until the 1500s. Farms layout, guilds struggled to replace skilled artisans, and monasteries, their monks wiped out, fell into ruin. The medieval world that reappeared after the plague was in many ways a vastly different place than what came before. Yet Europeans endured. Slowly and painfully, they rebuilt their lives from the ashes. Bit by bit, towns grew bustling again, economies spluttered back to life, and widowed spouses remarried and had children. Life with all its joys and sorrows continued. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that will to keep going even after the darkest of dark ages. In the decades after the Black Death, a few surprising social changes began to take root. Perhaps most significantly, the immense loss of life actually improved living standards for many of those who survived. With labor suddenly in short supply, workers and peasants found themselves with newfound bargaining power, leading to wage increases and landlords offering better terms to attract tenants. Social mobility also increased as enterprising commoners moved into roles left vacant by the plague. Some historians view the Black Death as a tipping point that initiated the slow decline of medieval feudalism. With the Black Death decimating so many nobles, the rigid hierarchy that had governed Europe for centuries began to crumble. A new middle class emerged, challenging the established order. The plague sowed the seeds of change that would eventually lead to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the birth of the modern world. Beyond its profound impact on society, the Black Death also spurred long overdue advancements in medicine and public health. Scholars began to track the plague's patterns and develop new methods of containment, recognizing the value of quarantine as a public health tool. Cities improved their sanitation systems, implementing designated waste removal and fresh water supplies. The Black Death had a profound philosophical and spiritual impact on medieval Europe. For some, it shook their faith in God and the Church, questioning how a just and loving deity could inflict such suffering. Others, however, found their beliefs tempered and deepened by the ordeal, viewing God as a source of strength and comfort amidst life's tribulations. The Black Death forced Europeans to confront death on an unprecedented scale, leading many to develop a new perspective on life's meaning and purpose. The medieval ideals of chivalry and courtly love, so preoccupied with earthly vanity, began to lose their luster. A more personal and introspective faith emerged, shaping the seeds of the Renaissance and Reformation. As individuals asserted their right to question authority and seek truth for themselves, these profound cultural shifts are embodied in the era's art and literature. Painters like Giotto broke away from the stiff, formulaic style of Gothic art, crafting figures with new depth, emotion, and humanity. Writers like Dante and Chaucer delved into profound questions of sin, salvation, and the essence of life in their literary masterpieces. A new humanism emerged, emphasizing individual conscience and experience as the cornerstones of truth-seeking. However, it would be a grave error to romanticize the Black Death as a necessary evil that ultimately uplifted Europe. The plague inflicted unimaginable suffering, traumatizing medieval society in ways that remain incomprehensible from our modern perspective. The long-term effects on various aspects, including the economy and the arts, are complex and debated. What is undeniable is the remarkable resilience of the human spirit demonstrated by those who survived the Black Death. In the face of the most catastrophic event in recorded history, Europeans gradually and painfully embarked on a journey of rebuilding, regrouping, and moving forward. As we've witnessed in our own times with modern pandemics, human beings possess an extraordinary capacity to adapt, endure, and even find glimmers of hope amidst periods of profound darkness. The stories of Black Death survivors serve as a testament to this indomitable spirit. Individuals like Agno Dura, a shoemaker from Siena, who buried his 5 children with his own hands, yet found the strength to establish a new family, exemplify this resilience. Similarly, Guillaume Machaut, a French composer who lost most of his peers to the pestilence, channeled his grief into soaring musical tributes to beauty and love. These are just a few of the countless ordinary heroes who quietly preserved the flame of human dignity during Europe's darkest hour. While we may never fully comprehend the harrowing experience of living through the relentless horror of the Black Death, the omnipresent terror of death, the grief of losing nearly everyone you love, and the gnawing fear of inescapable doom, we can find common threads of humanity with our medieval forebears in their unwavering determination to carry on day by day. In an uncertain world, we could do no worse than to remember the hard lessons and profound wisdom that emerged from the plague years. Hold your loved ones close, savor life's precious moments, and find beauty and meaning in the world around you. When humanity is tested to its very limits, these are the things that sustain us and guide us through the darkest valleys. The Black Death, a haunting spectre in our collective memory, serves as a grim reminder of life's fragility and preciousness. It was an apocalyptic event unlike any other in human history, whose echoes still resonate through the centuries. Yet amidst its darkest horrors, the unbreakable power of the human spirit shone through. The determination to carry on, to find hope, joy, and love against impossible odds, became a guiding light that continues to illuminate our path. It's a promise that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, life endures. As we reflect on the Black Death's impact and legacy, perhaps the most fitting tribute we can offer is to embrace that same spirit of resilience in our own lives. Let's meet challenges with courage, cherish moments of grace, and never stop striving for a better tomorrow. The road ahead may be winding and uncertain, but we walk it together, guided by the hard-earned wisdom of those who came before us. And though the journey may be long, morning will eventually come to an end, ushering in the eternal dawn for which we all carry on. Now, let's turn our attention to the tragic tale of the villagers of Ayam and their noble sacrifice in the face of unimaginable horror. In the fall of 1665, the bubonic plague arrived in this remote Derbyshire village, likely carried in a bale of cloth sent from London. The first victim was the young George Vickers, who swiftly succumbed to the pestilence. As the sickness began to spread, the villagers faced a heart-wrenching choice. They could flee the plague, scattering to nearby towns and villages in hopes of escaping infection. However, doing so risked spreading the plague far and wide across the countryside, potentially devastating the entire region. After much deliberation, the villagers of Ayam chose a path of immense courage and sacrifice. Guided by their rector, William Messon, and Puritan minister Thomas Stanley, they made an extraordinary pact. They would voluntarily quarantine their village, barring entry and exit until the plague subsided. This isolation would contain the plague but doom them in the process. It was a death sentence, and they knew it. For 14 months, the people of Am remained steadfast in their resolve as the plague ravaged their midst. They left food and supplies at the village boundary stone, relying on the outside world to do the same. Church services were held outdoors to minimize contagion, and families had to bury their own dead. The toll was devastating. One woman, Elizabeth Hancock, lost her husband and 6 children in just 8 days. The entire village of Taylor and his family was wiped out. By October 1666, when the plague subsided, 260 villagers had perished out of an original population of around 800. The Seydoux family was utterly decimated, with only one survivor left out of an initial 11. Despite the tragedy and horror, the people of Ayam held firm to their quarantine, oblivious to the world outside. Their selfless act spared the surrounding area from the worst of the plague. While other northern towns and villages were ravaged, The country parishes nearby Arm saw relatively few cases and deaths. The heroic story of Arm stands as a testament to the human spirit and capacity for self-sacrifice. Even in the face of unimaginable adversity, with immense losses, the people of Arm demonstrated the true meaning of courage and solidarity. Their legacy endures to this day, forever etched in the annals of history. As the plague continued its deadly march across Europe, medieval society began to crumble under the strain. With so many people dead or dying, crops rotted in the fields, and vital trades ground to a halt. The machinery of commerce and everyday life fell apart. Desperate to find someone to blame, people turned on each other in their fear and paranoia. Severe labor shortages caused wages to skyrocket as a shrinking pool of able-bodied workers gained new bargaining power. Many feudal lords resisted this change, trying to bind their peasants to the land as they had for generations. However, with entire villages depopulated, there was little they could do as people abandoned the manor for better prospects elsewhere. The Black Death had begun to undermine the very foundations of feudal society. In the grip of dread and despair, some people turned to wild debauchery, living for the moment as if there were no tomorrow. Others, driven mad by the plague's unspeakable horrors, roamed the land in marauding bands, looting and killing with impunity. The veneer of civilization was starting to crack. Disturbing rumors began to spread that the plague was actually the work of Jews who were accused of poisoning wells and afflicting their Christian neighbors. These baseless conspiracy theories took hold in the popular imagination, fueled further by anti-Semitic clergy and political elites. Across Europe, Jewish communities faced a rising tide of persecution and violence. In 1348, as the plague tightened its grip on the Holy Roman Empire, the Jewish population of Strasbourg was rounded up and burned alive in one of the deadliest programs of the Middle Ages. The 2,000 Jews then living in the city were given a grim choice: conversion or death. Most refused to abandon their faith and perished in the flames. Similar atrocities occurred in Cologne, Mainz, and other German cities as terrified people lashed out at convenient scapegoats. This shameful pattern of persecution would recur across Europe as the plague dragged on. In Basel, 600 Jews were murdered in 1349, their property seized, and their orphan children forcibly baptized. The Jewish communities of Frankfurt and Brussels were utterly destroyed. Arrogant Jews were subjected to horrific tortures by the Inquisition and pressured to confess to fabricated crimes. One man who fueled this wave of anti-Semitism was a German priest named Heinrich von Herford, an influential scholar and preacher. Von Herford delivered fiery sermons accusing Jews of spreading the plague and demanding their expulsion. He claimed that the Jews had made a pact with Satan to undermine Christendom and that the plague was God's punishment on humanity. Von Herford's incendiary words resonated with frightened Christians seeking someone to blame. His malicious accusations spread rapidly, intensifying hatred and paranoia and lending a veneer of legitimacy to the mob's worst impulses. Although he is largely forgotten today, von Herford played a crucial role in inciting anti-Semitic violence during the Black Death. As Jews and Gentiles alike suffered under the plague's relentless scourge, von Herford sowed seeds of suspicion and division, plunging a community already in crisis into further turmoil. It would take generations for Europe's Jewish population to recover from the devastation caused during these years. The Black Death was not merely a crisis of mortality, but also a crisis of solidarity and social cohesion. Indeed, as the plague persisted, acts of scapegoating and persecution were often accompanied by expressions of mysticism and penitent self-flagellation. Zealous laypeople known as the flagellants whipped themselves into a frenzy, traveling from town to town, preaching repentance and redemption through suffering. As the wretched buboes spread, inflicting agony and death in their wake, the people of Europe became increasingly gripped by paranoia and superstition. In their desperate search for someone to blame, many turned their attention to society's most vulnerable and marginalized groups. The Jews in particular found themselves at the center of persecution, longly scapegoated and distrusted across medieval Europe. Jews were now widely accused of deliberately spreading the plague. Wild rumors circulated that Jews were poisoning wells, plotting to destroy Christianity, or collaborating with dark forces to unleash the disease. These baseless conspiracy theories spread rapidly amidst panic and social upheaval. In Toulon, France, the Jewish community faced a vicious attack in the spring of 1348. Rioters burned the Jewish quarter and massacred numerous innocent people. By the end of the year, hundreds of Jewish communities had been destroyed across Europe, from Spain to Switzerland to Germany. Tragically, one of the most infamous attacks occurred in the city of Strasbourg. In February 1349, a mob of enraged townsfolk and peasants from the surrounding countryside descended upon the Jewish quarter. They forcibly gathered the city's 2,000 Jews, herded them onto a wooden platform erected in the cemetery, and burned them alive in a single night of horrific bloodshed. Those who agreed to convert to Christianity were spared. These grotesque programs stand as dark chapters in history, fueled by a toxic combination of fear, desperation, and ancient prejudices. However, the Jews were not the sole targets of persecution during the Black Death's reign of terror. Lepers, the poor, foreigners, beggars, and Romani people were also vulnerable to discrimination. Virtually anyone on the fringes of society became potential scapegoats. In some regions, the sick were dragged from their homes and left to die in the streets. The most common accusation of bringing sickness could lead to swift and brutal retaliation during those fearful times. Despite Europeans lashing out at the vulnerable in their midst, the plague disregarded distinctions of race, creed, or class. Death fell upon both the rich and the poor, humbling princes and commoners alike, and collapsing social hierarchies like fragile houses of cards. Among those who found themselves brought low was Princess Joan of England. Joan, the daughter of King Edward III, was just 14 when her father arranged for her to marry 13-year-old Prince Pedro of Castile. This union was intended to strengthen England's alliance with Spain. In the summer of 1348, the princess embarked on a grand procession to meet her groom, accompanied by an entourage of ladies, courtiers, and servants. However, this grand journey would never reach its destination. As the royal party traveled through France, the telltale signs of illness began to manifest. First, a handmaiden fell ill, suffering from fevers and chills. Subsequently, several guards succumbed to the same ailment. The pestilence spread rapidly through the caravan, causing immense horror for young Joan as one by one, her companions succumbed to agonizing deaths. Stranded in the plague-ravaged landscape, the teenager found her royal rank powerless against the sickness that now besieged her body. After a valiant struggle, the princess finally breathed her last in Bordeaux in September 1348, never to meet her betrothed. Joan's tragic tale serves as a poignant reminder of the devastating impact of the Black Death. High birth did not offer any protection when the plague swept through. In fact, the well-to-do and highborn often fared worse than commoners, as their more lavish lifestyles exposed them to greater risk of infection. Many noble families found their lineages abruptly extinguished and grand estates reduced to ghostly echoing chambers. For instance, in the Duchy of Gloucester, the plague wreaked havoc on the nobility in late 1348 and early 1349. The Duke, the Earl, and a significant portion of the region's knights and gentry all perished in rapid succession, leaving a profound power vacuum. The surviving aristocrats scrambled to assert control and rally what remained of their decimated ranks. Similar scenarios unfolded across Europe as the plague dismantled long-held status quo and disrupted entrenched hierarchies. The Catholic Church, a bastion of stability for centuries, was severely affected as clergymen succumbed to the disease in droves. The sight of once revered priests and bishops, their faces pocked with searing sores and dying in misery like any other wretched soul, severely tarnished the Church's aura of divine authority in the eyes of many. Some, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Bradine, valiantly strove to guide their flock through the valley of death. The Archbishop tirelessly worked to alleviate the suffering of the afflicted and offer spiritual solace, embodying Christian charity and steadfastness until the plague claimed his life in August 1349. Tragically for every Bradine, there were countless clergymen who fled their parishes in terror or sought refuge behind abbey walls as the plague raged. This abdication of moral leadership, coupled with the devastating toll the plague took on the clergy, left the Church weakened and its foundations crumbling. While it would retain immense power and influence, the Black Death sowed the seeds for the coming upheavals of the Reformation era. Amidst the numerous grim tales of the plague years, however, there were also glimmers of light, selflessness and resilience emerging from the darkest depths. Communities rallied together, neighbors aiding one another as best they could. Women often found themselves thrust into new leadership roles as male heads of households perished. Skilled physicians, apothecaries, and folk healers worked tirelessly to alleviate the suffering around them, knowing they might pay with their lives. And through it all, a tenacious spark remained: hope. Hope that this ravaging storm would soon pass over. Hope that the relentless scythe of death would spare the next house. Hope that the Lord's mercy would spare a beloved child, husband, sister, or friend. Fragile yet stubborn, this flicker of hope sustained many through the darkest of times, an inner light that shielded them from the encroaching darkness. For as deep as the suffering gouged, and as heavy as the losses weighed, the people endured, survived, and gradually rebuilt from the ashes and bones. Life, in all its sorrow and sweetness, continued in a world forever changed. A world that would never forget the plague's cruel lessons, even as it approached a new dawn. As the flagellants traveled across Europe, whipping themselves into a pious frenzy, the plague relentlessly marched on. No corner of the continent was spared its devastation. From the sun-baked shores of Sicily to the misty moors of Scotland, the spectre of death hung heavy in the air. One of the most harrowing accounts of this time comes from the Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio. In his masterwork, The Decameron, he vividly describes the plague's toll on his native Florence. Boccaccio writes that as the pestilence spread, it grew ever more deadly, filling the hearts of men and women with such fear that brother abandoned brother, uncle abandoned nephew, sister left brother, and very often wife abandoned husband. What is even more astonishing is that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children as if they had not been theirs. Boccaccio's words paint a chilling picture of a society in collapse, with the bonds of family and community fraying under the weight of sheer terror. Yet, even in this darkest of hours, there were still those who rose above the panic and self-preservation. Consider the case of Agnel Dura, a chronicler from the Tuscan city of Siena. As the plague tightened its grip on the city, Agnello took it upon himself to record the names of the dead so that they might not be forgotten. Day after day, he traversed the stricken city, meticulously cataloguing the fallen with care. By the time the plague had run its course, Agnel had filled several volumes with the names of his fellow citizens, a poignant testament to the magnitude of the loss. However, Agnel's work was more than just a grim accounting. In a time when so many died alone and unmourned, his record served as a kind of surrogate eulogy, ensuring that each victim was remembered as a unique individual rather than just another number in a staggering death toll. In this small yet significant way, Agnello played a role in preserving the humanity of his city, even as the plague relentlessly sought to erase it. Throughout Europe during this dark period, similar acts of quiet heroism emerged. In the French city of Rouen, a group of nuns known as the Sisters of Hôtel Dieu dedicated themselves to tending to the sick and dying, despite the devastating impact of the pestilence on their own ranks. In England, a monk named John Clint diligently documented the progress of the plague within his abbey, infusing his somber account with moments of grace and selflessness. These stories serve as a poignant reminder that even in the face of unimaginable horror, the human spirit possesses extraordinary resilience and compassion. They stand as flickering beacons of hope against the encroaching darkness, representing the tiny triumphs that defy despair. As the plague gradually weakened its grip on Europe in the early 1350s, the continent underwent profound transformations. Estimates suggest that between a third and half of the population had perished, resulting in a staggering loss that would take centuries to recover from. Villages lay abandoned, their inhabitants swept away by the pestilence. Fields lay barren, trade routes fell silent, and the once thriving cities were reduced to mere shadows of their former selves. However, amidst the ruin and despair, there were also signs of renewal. The drastic reduction in population led to a sudden surge in the value of labor. Peasants who had once been bound to the land as serfs found themselves in high demand, able to negotiate wages and conditions that were unimaginable just a few years earlier. This shift contributed to the gradual dismantling of the rigid hierarchy of the feudal system, paving the way for the emergence of a new social order. In the realm of art and culture, the plague left an indelible mark. The somber motif of the dance, macabre or dance of death, became a common sight in churches and public squares, serving as a grim reminder of the fragility of life. At the same time, there was a renewed appreciation for the pleasures of the present moment, as evidenced by the rise of humanism and the flourishing of vernacular literature. One of the most striking examples of this post-plague sensibility can be found in the work of Geoffrey Chaucer. Writing in the 1380s, a generation after the worst of the plague had subsided, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are infused with a vivacity and earthiness that seems to directly respond to the austerity of the plague years. His pilgrims, from the wealthy wife of Bath to the worldly monk, are vivid and relatable characters who revel in the simple joys of food, drink, and companionship. Chaucer's masterpiece stands as a testament to the enduring power of storytelling and the human capacity to find light even in the darkest of times. It reminds us that no matter how bleak the circumstances, there is always room for laughter, fellowship, and hope. As we reflect on the Black Death from the vantage point of the 21st century, it can be difficult to comprehend the scale of the devastation it caused. The idea of losing half the world's population to a single disease seems almost unimaginable, a catastrophe more suited to dystopian fiction than historical reality. Yet, the lessons of the plague remain as relevant today as they were 700 years ago. In a world still grappling with pandemics, both literal and metaphorical, the Black Death serves as a sobering reminder of our own vulnerability and the urgent need for compassion and solidarity in the face of shared crises. Simultaneously, the stories of those who lived through the plague, including poets, chroniclers, nuns, and monks, offer a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. They remind us that even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, the human spirit is capable of remarkable acts of kindness, courage, and creativity. As we navigate our own uncertain times, we would do well to remember the example of those who lived through the Black Death. They taught us that even in the darkest of times, there is always the potential for renewal and rebirth. The darkest night must eventually give way to dawn. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Black Death is that in the face of devastation and despair, the only true antidote is to cling to our shared humanity. We must reach out to one another with compassion and empathy and find strength in the bonds of community. This lesson has echoed down through the centuries and remains as relevant now as it was in the plague-stricken streets of medieval Europe. As we come to the end of our journey through the shadow of the Black Death, let us take a moment to remember those who lived and died during that terrible time, the countless souls who were lost to the pestilence, and the brave few who fought to preserve the light of human kindness in a world gone mad. Their stories are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and a reminder that even in the face of the greatest adversity, hope and compassion will always find a way to endure. May their memory be a blessing, and may their example inspire us to face our own challenges with grace, courage, and an unshakable faith in the power of our shared humanity. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry their stories with us into our dreams. Let us find comfort in the knowledge that no matter how dark the night may seem, the dawn will always come. And let us wake in the morning with renewed resolve to build a world of greater kindness, compassion, and hope. A world that would make those long-ago survivors of the Black Death proud. As the plague tightened its grip on Europe, entire towns were decimated. Eyewitness accounts paint a grim picture of the pestilence's relentless onslaught. In Florence, Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio lamented that such fear and fanciful notions gripped the living, leading almost everyone to adopt a cruel policy. They avoided the sick and everything associated with them, believing it would safeguard their own safety. The plague, however, disregarded class and status boundaries. In England, King Edward III's daughter, Princess Joan, succumbed to the disease on her way to marry Prince Pedro of Castile in 1348. The Scots initially believed the divine wind favoured them when the plague struck an invading English army, resulting in the death of their commander. However, they soon faced their own devastating outbreak, proving that the dreaded pestilence was no respecter of borders. In the French city of Avignon, home to the papal court, the sickness claimed an estimated 50% of the population. Pope Claymore VI found himself issuing last rites through the windows as the contagion swept through his residence. Desperate to protect himself, the pontiff sat between two constantly burning fires, hoping the heat would ward off the mysterious malady. Despite his efforts, the plague relentlessly advanced. No corner of Europe was spared the devastation. From Scandinavia to Sicily, the Black Death cast its long shadow. The Italian writer Angelo Dura poignantly captured the plague's terrible toll, lamenting, "So many died that all believed it was the end of the world." In the Norwegian village of Bland, archaeologists have uncovered a mass grave containing over 100 skeletons, their twisted forms serving as grim witnesses to the Black Death's passage. Faced with such unimaginable loss, medieval society began to fracture. With so many dead fields, layow and livestock roamed unattended. Food shortages and famine soon followed in the plague's wake. The stench of death hung heavy in the air as corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. Many simply fled in terror, desperately seeking to escape the advancing sickness. The once bustling ports of Europe, the lifeblood of medieval trade, transformed into silent ghost towns as the plague paralyzed commerce. In the German city of Bremen, visiting ships were compelled to wait 40 days before unloading their cargoes, giving rise to the practice of quarantine. However, even this measure proved insufficient to halt the relentless spread of the pestilence, which was carried by fleas residing in the fur of rats. As panic and paranoia surged, medieval society sought scapegoats for the calamity that had befallen them. Tragically, suspicion often fell upon Europe's Jewish communities. In 1349, the citizens of Strasbourg brutally murdered over 900 Jews, burning them alive in a public square. This horrific incident was repeated in cities across Germany and beyond, fueled by fear and ignorance, resulting in a savage persecution. Despite the widespread devastation and death, there were instances of remarkable compassion amidst the darkness. In the English village of Eyam, the courageous clergyman William Mizon persuaded his parishioners to quarantine themselves to prevent the plague's spread. For 14 months, the villagers endured the ordeal stoically as the plague gradually decimated their numbers. Their noble sacrifice ultimately spared the neighboring towns from infection. Such selfless acts were rare in a time of unrelenting horror, as most people could only watch helplessly as the Black Death claimed victim after victim, seemingly without end. The Italian chronicler Agnolo Dura vividly captured the plague's grim toll, stating, "So many died that all believed it was the end of the world. It must have seemed to many that the apocalypse was at hand." However, even the Black Death eventually exhausted itself. By 1351, the worst of the pestilence had passed, leaving a shattered and traumatized Europe in its wake. An estimated 30 to 60% of the continent's population had perished, with some regions experiencing a loss of up to 80% of their inhabitants. This demographic catastrophe stands as an unparalleled tragedy in human history. As the survivors gradually emerged from their boarded-up homes and embarked on the arduous task of rebuilding their shattered lives, they found themselves in a world that had undergone profound transformations. The devastating impact of the plague had decimated the workforce, creating a labor shortage that fueled a surge in demand for labor. Peasants and artisans, who had once been bound by rigid social hierarchies, found themselves empowered to command wages that were unimaginable just a few years prior. This newfound autonomy began to erode the foundations of feudalism, leading to a gradual dismantling of the rigid social structure. In England, the scarcity of labor emboldened peasants to challenge the authority of their noble masters. The simmering tensions reached a boiling point in 1381, culminating in the Peasants' Revolt. This massive uprising saw thousands of angry peasants march on London, setting buildings ablaze and clashing with royal troops. Although the rebellion was ultimately crushed, it marked a significant turning point in the relationship between the nobility and the common people. The Black Death also sparked a renewed interest in science and medicine as scholars sought to comprehend and combat the enigmatic pestilence. Italian Dr. Marsilio Ficino made groundbreaking contributions by pioneering the use of aromatic herbs to purify miasmas, or tainted air believed to spread disease. His pioneering work laid the groundwork for the development of modern public health practices. In the realm of religion, the Black Death dealt a severe blow to the Catholic Church's authority. Many individuals grappled with reconciling the Church's teachings with the seemingly indiscriminate nature of the plague. Amidst this crisis, the Larders, a heretical sect that rejected papal authority and advocated for a vernacular Bible, found fertile ground for their ideas. Although labeled as heretics, their calls for reform foreshadowed the eventual Protestant Reformation. The Black Death also left an indelible mark on medieval art and culture. In the aftermath of the plague, artists increasingly gravitated towards macabre themes, creating works imbued with images of death and decay. The dance macabre, or dance of death, emerged as a popular motif, depicting skeletons leading individuals from all walks of life in a grim procession towards the grave. One of the most haunting artistic responses to the plague was the triumph of death, captured in a fresco painted by Francisco Trini in the Italian city of Pisa. The nightmarish scene depicts a towering skeleton wielding a scythe, overseeing a landscape littered with corpses. This work poignantly conveyed the sense of helplessness and despair that gripped many in the aftermath of the plague. However, even amidst the darkness, there were glimmers of hope and resilience. In Florence, a group of young people immortalized in Dante's Divine Comedy fled the plague-ravaged city and sought refuge in a country villa. There they spent their time recounting stories, weaving a tapestry of 100 tales of love, lust, and adventure. Their decision to embrace life in the face of death embodied the unyielding spirit that sustained many through the plague's darkest days. As the years passed, the Black Death gradually faded into history, becoming a grim legend. Yet the memories of its devastating visitation lingered raw for generations to come. On the island of Sardinia, villagers still perform a macabre death dance known as the Marmu. Their blackened faces serve as a ghostly reminder of the bubonic curse that once engulfed the Mediterranean. In the aftermath of the plague, Europe slowly began to recover, its population rebounding as a new generation replaced those lost to the pestilence. However, the Black Death had left an indelible mark on the medieval world, reshaping society in profound ways that would reverberate through the centuries. The rigid feudal order that had dominated Europe for generations crumbled, paving the way for the emergence of a new middle class. The Catholic Church, once the unquestioned arbiter of spiritual life, faced unprecedented challenges to its authority. The Black Death also sparked a renewed interest in classical learning as scholars delved into ancient texts in search of answers to the plague's mysteries. This revival of classical scholarship, known as the Renaissance, ultimately gave birth to a new era of artistic and intellectual creativity that transformed European culture. Perhaps the plague's most enduring legacy was the stark reminder it offered of life's fragility. In a world where death could strike at any moment, many began to question the rigid certainties of medieval life. The Black Death had demonstrated that even kings and popes were powerless in the face of nature's fury. This realization sparked a new spirit of inquiry and individualism that would ultimately give rise to the modern age. For those who lived through the plague's dark days, the memories of the pestilence would haunt them for the rest of their lives. However, in the end, the human spirit proved stronger than even the Black Death. The survivors picked up the pieces of their shattered world and slowly began to rebuild. Their resilience served as a testament to the enduring power of hope in the face of unimaginable adversity. Even today, the specter of the Black Death looms large in our collective imagination, a grim reminder of the ever-present threat of pandemic disease. Nevertheless, the lessons of the plague, the importance of public health, the resilience of the human spirit, and the need for compassion and solidarity in the face of crisis remain as relevant now as they were 7 centuries ago. As we reflect on the Black Death's horrific toll, we are reminded of the fragility of life and the preciousness of every moment. In a world where darkness can descend at any instant, we must cherish the light and love that sustain us, even in the face of unimaginable loss. For it is in these fleeting moments of connection and compassion that we find the strength to endure, to rise from the ashes of tragedy, and to build a brighter tomorrow. So let us remember the Black Death not only as a tale of unimaginable loss, but as a testament to the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. Let us honor the memory of those who perished by striving to create a world of greater kindness, empathy, and understanding. Let us confront the challenges of our own time with the same courage and determination that sustained our ancestors during the darkest days of the plague. For ultimately, it is not the darkness that defines us, but the light we kindle despite it. It is in this eternal dance of shadow and illumination that the human spirit endures, ever resilient, ever hopeful, a flickering flame that no pestilence can extinguish. And it is in this enduring light that we find the promise of a better tomorrow, even amidst the darkest of nights. Sure, I'd be happy to continue the script for what medieval times were like during the Black Plague. Boring history for sleep. Here's the final part of the narration. As winter melted into spring in the year of our Lord 1353, the people of Europe began to emerge from the long, dark night of the Black Death's reign of terror. In many regions, the plague had burned itself out after consuming all available victims. Those who remained through luck, isolation, or perhaps some natural immunity looked around at a world utterly transformed. In some areas, entire villages lay abandoned, the only sign of life the weeds growing up through the dusty streets. Many great cities had lost half their population or more. The survivors wandered through once bustling neighborhoods, their silence broken only by the cries of orphaned children and the wails of grieving widows. But amid the devastation, there were glimmers of hope and resilience. In the Italian city of Siena, the civic-minded Franciscan friar Barnaba della Siena organized relief efforts for the poor and advocated for public health measures to prevent future outbreaks. In England, the newly crowned King Edward III issued a proclamation urging his subjects to resume their normal lives and return to work, promising to protect them from lawlessness and disorder. Indeed, as the shock of the plague gradually subsided, Europeans embarked on a slow and arduous journey of rebuilding their shattered world. Farmers resumed their work in the fields, merchants reopened their shops, and the wheels of commerce and industry began to spin once more. Although the road to recovery would be long and arduous, the indomitable human spirit had proven resilient. In the aftermath of the plague, medieval society underwent a profound transformation. The massive loss of life had created a labor shortage, empowering peasants and weakening the rigid feudal hierarchy. Many peasants abandoned the customs of their lords in pursuit of better opportunities in the burgeoning cities, which flourished as never before. The old social order was crumbling, giving way to a new, more fluid society in its infancy. Simultaneously, the trauma of the Black Death left an indelible mark on the medieval psyche. The spectre of death had never loomed so large, and the art, literature, and religious beliefs of the late Middle Ages were imbued with a profound sense of life's fleeting impermanence. The danse macabre, or dance of death, emerged as a popular artistic motif, depicting the Grim Reaper leading individuals from all walks of life in a somber procession to the grave. However, there was a silver lining to this morbid preoccupation. Confronted with the fragility of life, people became acutely aware of the significance of living each day to the fullest. The Italian poet Dante Alighieri, who witnessed the horrors of the plague firsthand, captured this sentiment in his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, stating, "It was not death itself, but the fear of death that had been the greatest torment." As Europe emerged from the shadow of the Black Death, it was a transformed world, socially, economically, artistically, and spiritually. The old medieval order had vanished forever, and the seeds of the Renaissance and the modern age had been sown in the fertile soil of tragedy. Perhaps the great Italian poet Petrarch, who lost his beloved Laura to the plague, best encapsulated this transformation, stating, "Perhaps the greatest torment was not death itself, but the fear of death." O happy posterity, who will never experience such abysmal woe and will view our testimony as a fable. Although the plague would sporadically flare up for centuries to come, it would never again bring humanity to the brink as it did during those terrible years of the 14th century, the Black Death. It tested the human spirit as never before, and in the end the human spirit endured. The medieval world was gone, but a new world beckoned on the horizon. Thus, we conclude our journey through one of the most harrowing chapters in human history. The story of the Black Death is ultimately a tale of human resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. It serves as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and renewal are always waiting on the other side. Thank you for joining me on this excursion into the distant past. I hope you found it both informative and restful. If you've enjoyed our time together, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'll be here waiting with more soothing stories to lull you into a peaceful slumber. Until next time, sweet dreams.